I came across an interview with Jacob Berman with John Kloppenborg asking the questions about Jesus' historicity. Does his work in some way help us on the quest for the historical Jesus? His work on the Christ assemblies, their associations to other groups using a heuristic approach, because we don't have great data for early Christ groups. We just don't have the numbers and a lot of the information we find from other cultic groups and their practices. But can we glean from those other groups an idea in something to be able to understand the Christ groups in the first century? That's what his book does. So I asked him a few poignant questions about this topic of Jesus' historicity, and this is what he had to say.
Well, this is, I think I have to say, Christ Association does not deal with this at all. I haven't entered into the mythicist debate except very casually sometimes in a class that I might teach with undergraduate students. So this is not my area.
We got another one here from MythVision. MythVision has donated as 3 super chat questions here. Thanks for your support, Derek. He says, can your work on Christ groups help us in the quest for the historical Jesus and its Christ group origins? Excellent scholar, Jacob.
Yes. Excuse me. The difficulty is that for first century Palestine, we have so little data that allows us to reconstruct real networks. There is I've just finished a paper which is going to come out in a book edited by Chris Keith, using network theory to think about early Christ groups that in Palestine, and it has to do with understanding how the fishing industry worked. The fishing industry was one of the most networked of ancient occupations, partly because fishermen didn't build their own boats. They relied on shipwrights to build for them. And at least the boat that we know of, the only boat that we know of from first century in Palestine, is made of Lebanese cedar. That is, it's not made of local wood. It's made of imported wood. So that already tells you that somebody has either brought the cedar planks from Lebanon to the Galilee in order to construct the boat, or the boat was constructed in the Lebanon and brought down to the Galilee. So you can already start to imagine a kind of network connection between a shipwright located somewhere, wood suppliers, and fishermen. But fishermen also depended on nets, which were typically made out of linen, which means that there's a connection with the growing of flax and the manufacture of linen and the weaving of linen into nets. Linen is used in nets because it's invisible to fish. They can't see it. Fishing also required net weights, were typically made of lead. Lead doesn't come from Palestine. Lead is mined in Sunion in the peninsula of Achaia, or in Malta, sometimes in Spain, sometimes in Asia Minor, which means then lead is brought to Palestine, probably in ingots on ships, and we actually have recovered some of these from shipwrecks off the coast of Palestine, and then made into net weights. Similarly, fish hooks are made of bronze, and net tools are made of bronze. So the fishing industry, there's more connections too, but the fishing industry depends on a whole network of suppliers of various kinds of material, from nets to boats to sails to net weights to fish hooks and so forth. But it is also the most connected of ancient, one of the most connected of ancient occupations to tax collection. And that's because fish, the second you take them out of the water, they start to rot, which means they have to be removed immediately, either to market or to the fish processors who produce something called garum. And which means as soon as the fish come out of the water, there has to be somebody there to tax them. And we've got examples from Egypt of exactly this thing happening. A tax official basically standing on the shore, counting the number of fish that come in on every cast of every net, sorting out or figuring out what their value is. And before the fish then are packed off to the market, he's got a record of the taxes owing, probably the rent that's owing, if the fishermen have to pay rent to somebody, and that's all reported to the banking system. So it's interesting that the only two occupations mentioned in the Gospels connected with Jesus are fishermen and tax collectors, and that's also because the two of them are connected. Tax collectors are always hanging around fishermen because, as I say, when you raise grain or vineyards and so forth, the tax people show up only at harvest time, only in August. But if you're fishing, the tax people are there all the time. That maybe helps us think about some of the network connections in which Jesus was embedded. He's not himself a fisherman, but he's connected with fishermen, and he's apparently connected with tax collectors. So in that sort of limited sense, looking at networks in Palestine might help us to think a bit more concretely about Jesus, maybe how the early Christ movement initially spread through those groups of tax collectors and fishermen, because, as I say, these people are heavily networked in a way in which grain farmers and other kinds of farmers weren't as networked. So that's not a very good answer, and that's mostly because we've got such limited data on networks in Palestine. We just don't have data. We don't have sources. But in a few limited places, we can start to piece together some kinds of networks that existed to which Jesus, the historical Jesus, seems to have been connected.
Another super chat from MythVision. Pertaining to the historical Jesus, is there anything in Paul and his associations that help us believe Jesus was a real human and not complete myth? Well,
Paul, I don't think there's anything that can prove that, but it's absolutely clear that Paul thinks that Jesus was a real human who was crucified, and Paul also then says he's raised by God. Now, one wouldn't say that about a myth. It's also, I think, the case that the followers of Attis, we might regard the Attis and the Kybele story as a myth, but the followers thought that Attis was a real person, a real young man who emasculated himself and eventually died. I don't think anything that Paul says can prove to a modern historian that Jesus lived, but there's no reason not to think that Paul thought that Jesus was a real human being and certainly not a myth. And that's, I think, the case with other early Christian writers. They didn't imagine that this was simply a fabricated story.
We got another one from MythVision again. Your thoughts about mythicism, Dr. Kloppenborg?
You mean by mythicism the notion that that Jesus is a kind of fabricated figure? I mean, if that's what, I don't know if that's what you mean by mythicism.
That's something. The idea that Jesus never existed. Yes.
Well, I think what the mythicists have in favor of their view, Robert Price, and actually now Tom Brody, is that there are lots and lots of features, there are multiple features of the Jesus story that look a lot like the myth of the dying and rising God, and so forth. That itself as far as I'm concerned, doesn't decide the question one way or another, because persons, heroes in antiquity, that is, people that we know to have existed, or at least we are pretty sure existed, can also have their stories overlaid with these mythic elements. I'm not inclined to agree with Brody or Price and others that we've got evidence of the non-existence of Jesus as a human being. It seems to me what we've got is evidence that stories about Jesus had various kinds of accretions, some of which look a lot like these kind of dying and rising God stories.
We've got another super chat from MythVision. Thank you, Derek. His question is, did cultic groups like Dionysus, Athena, Hercules, Apollonius, Diana, etc. believe their deified figure was a historical figure like Jesus? Examples?
I would say well, in the case of Apollonius of Tyana, I think there's not any doubt about it that he was the historical figure. Heracles, I think, is certainly represented as a historical figure. Dionysus also. I take it that sort of in the back of this question is the mythicist question again. I think you have to ask the question, did the devotees of the Heracleasti, the groups devoted to Heracles or Dionysus, did they think that they were worshiping a real person with divine attributes? I think the answer is absolutely they did. They didn't think that they were worshiping a myth or a made-up thing. Now, as historians, we might ask the question, was Heracles ever a thing? Was he ever a person? I actually have no idea how you would answer that question. Or was Dionysus a real human being? Again, I don't know how you could possibly answer that question. But I think it's pretty clear that the devotees thought that they were real historical persons. I think I've said as much as I can say that there's weaknesses of mythicism. That is, there's a kind of a logical issue in mythicism to deal with, and that is the fact that a particular character, like Heracles or Pythagoras or Jesus or whatever, may have been a human being, and in the course of the transmission of stories about that hero, there are heroic patterns, mythic patterns overlaid. I think that simply goes without saying. That itself doesn't tell you whether the character in question represents a real historical individual or not. It tells us nothing.
Join MythVision's Patreon today to access hundreds of videos that I have worked hard in high quality content that are not in public domain. They're only on the Patreon. You will also have direct access to me, referring academics, questions, ideas, or just want a private chat. You have that access with me. Also, I'm trying to do more traveling to educate people from more academics and expand what kind of material I do produce on MythVision. This is a full-time gig, and you're helping the community by joining. I'm trying to put together more to educate people who have harmful cultic practices or ways in which they're harming society. We are educating them from MythVision on better understanding these ancient texts and mythologies and history in a way like not many shows do. So please, I could use your help, and you're going to get and benefit a lot by joining as a member.